Hi everyone, welcome to Privacy Now. I'm Mike Fibus. You know, we all had high hopes last year when Europe's wide-sweeping privacy legislation, GDPR, went into effect. But thus far it seems all it's done for us is force us to click on yet another accept button on our favorite websites. Will California's new privacy law, which goes into effect at the start of next year, be more of the same, or will this one have some teeth behind it? Here to talk about this and other privacy issues, we're fortunate to have with us Haley Tsukayama. Haley heads up privacy legislation activity at the state level at the Electronic Frontier Foundation. Haley, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, so let's start with what I said. GDPR, do you more or less agree that that's what we're left with, is a good idea with not much teeth?
Well, I certainly see that point of view. I think GDPR was a very complicated law. You're looking at a lot of jurisdictions trying to comply with it and make everything come together. So I agree that a year out, it doesn't seem like it's doing much, but I think it's also a little bit early to really judge how effective it's going to be and how good it's going to be for consumers. There are a lot of great ideas in GDPR, and I think we're seeing governments in Europe sort of coming up with cases, looking more at cases and talk to the public interest groups out there. They're really still kind of figuring out what they can do and kind of complaints they can bring under GDPR. So, it's probably still too early to tell, but I do certainly understand, they talked a big game about privacy legislation and sort of all the things that were going to happen when GDPR passed, and a year out, it doesn't, we haven't seen those come to full fruition yet.
Yeah, yeah, good point. I guess we need to wait a little bit longer, although we're all very frustrated with privacy, so.
Yeah, that is a function of how long we've been sitting here, with our privacy rights, completely unprotected by law. So I think, certainly I think public opinion is much further along on, what we can and should do when it comes to governing how companies operate. But laws move slowly and deliberatively for a reason. So we'll just have to wait and see.
Okay, I know you've been watching CCPA, California's upcoming privacy law, very closely, and it seems like this is going to be a nail biter as we get into the last little tweaks coming up to January 1st. What's your assessment?
So I think, so as you alluded, they passed CCPA last year, and it goes into effect in January. So we're in sort of a bit of a gap. And I think the expectation, which has come true, was that, we were going to see companies really try and introduce amendments to water down the law. I will say for our part in at EFF, and we work with a bunch of other privacy organizations, ACLU, Privacy Rights Clearinghouse, Consumer Reports, Common Sense Media. We all backed a bill to add more enforcement to CCPA earlier this year. That didn't make it through the whole process. So that's now what they call in California a 2-year bill. So we could see it come back in January. Which is all to say, our strengthening efforts didn't go anywhere, but we also have been fairly successful in stopping some of the worst amendments to weaken CCPA. And so I think largely, as it stands right now, we're looking at a law that will go into effect that has all the basic protections of CCPA. It will be, I hope, largely the same, although the legislative session is not over, and I understand language always comes back. So we will keep up the fight to make sure that we can defend this law as much as we can.
So for those of us in the 49 other states, does CCPA matter to us? Is it a bellwether of things that might come for the rest of the country, or does it affect us more immediately?
So that's a great question. I think, so it's important to know what CCPA does. So it grants 4 basic rights: a right to know, a right to deletion, a right to data portability, and sort of a limited anti-discrimination. So you can't charge more for privacy. You can't make it a luxury good. And so, those are really important rights. And to answer the first part of your question, I think we have seen other states sort of look at the California model, draft legislation. We haven't seen any other state pass that kind of legislation this year. But we are seeing people look at it. I think we also are hearing a lot at the federal level about people looking at CCPA as a potential model. But as you said, it doesn't go into effect until January. And I think what I've seen certainly in a lot of, other states is they say, well, let's let California enact this law and see what happens there before we move on our own. But to answer the second part of your question, of course, this law applies to any company that has consumers in California. So we are going to see companies have to come into compliance with CCPA if they do any business in California, which probably means that they're going to change their privacy policies. And so in theory, at least, companies that do any business in California will have to kind of raise the bar. And so the hope is that, that consumers in other states will get some of these rights, or at least, they will be enshrined in the policies of these companies. So we could see a more immediate effect.
Now, there is some activity brewing in several states. Some of them aren't as wide sweeping, of course. They may focus on facial recognition, for example, or location. Could that potentially pose a problem for companies that deal nationally or internationally online, where you have to manage what you do where, or make sure you're compliant everywhere?
So I'm not a lawyer. I'm not a compliance lawyer. So I hate to, really give any strong compliance or legal advice. But, I think this is sort of what people refer to as the patchwork argument, right? That it's like hard for companies to comply with a patchwork of state laws, or as you say, international laws. I guess the answer to me, certainly what I saw as a reporter when I was talking to people about, say, the Equifax breach or something like that, is that generally what companies would say is that they would look at, sort of what the most stringent rules were across the states and just try and comply with that. And so, I'm not going to, again, I'm not a lawyer. I've never had to deal with implementing compliance on that end. So I'm not going to say it's easy, but I think, we often see people do it. It is a reality in this world that different jurisdictions have different laws. And I think basically if there's a strong law somewhere that has to raise the standard for everybody, I don't have a lot of sympathy for, people who say that that's difficult.
The patchwork argument certainly is used often, that don't do it in the states. This should be a federal activity. But the flip side of that, of course, is if we wait for federal legislation, our digital online footprint could die of old age, really, with us. Do you see any, any bright spots on the federal landscape?
Well, I think, sort of what all news is good news, right? Like it's interesting. Certainly, I started really covering, policy as a reporter at the Washington Post in 2010. And, we saw the Privacy Bill of Rights, and, I feel like every year that I was a reporter, I saw privacy legislation come back, and then, people just say, oh, well, that would be nice, but, there's no need, or, the need is not pressing, or, companies have agreed to abide by certain standards. And so, we never really saw things moving. Now, in the past couple of years, we've seen companies, really get some pointed questions from Congress. I think we've really seen more movement on privacy legislation. So, Washington, D.C. is, you could say deliberative, you could say gridlocked, depending on how you feel about it. But, but these are serious conversations. And I think, to me anyway, from the perspective that I have, more serious and more thoughtful than I have seen in a long time. And so I don't know that we're going to get federal privacy legislation this year, because I do think that, at least from what I've read in articles, they are not close to agreeing on the same things. But it's good to see these conversations. It's good to see these conversations happening seriously. And it's also good to see companies taking those conversations seriously. So I think we're in a good setup period. But of course, I do not want to predict what Washington, D.C. will or will not do.
No, nor should you. No, but it's not. um, you know, and as you mentioned, I mean, they're not only starting to take notice, but you know, we're starting to see the government hold these companies accountable. Like last month, Facebook was fined $5 billion. So you can argue about whether that was enough or not enough. I think we all have our opinions, but they are doing something. It is certainly different in the post Cambridge Analytica era.
Yeah, I think that's definitely true. And, again, I think signals both to companies and to lawmakers that these are issues that people are taking seriously, right? It's no longer slaps on the wrist. It's at least, I personally would have trouble paying a $5 billion fine. So, with a B, as you say, people can argue about whether that fine was appropriate or, all that kind of stuff. Again, I'm not a lawyer, so I don't want to weigh in on that necessarily. But yeah, I mean, as you say, we're seeing serious action. So
something I know you have weighed in on is the value of our data, whether it's a good thing in the first place to do that. If you do the calculations from the Facebook fine and how many of us there are in the country, if you look at the Equifax settlement and how many of us that affected, even if you look at Amazon's Prime Day deal of a $10 discount, there's starting to be some very small movements toward a little bit of compensation. But I know you have mixed feelings about that, to say the least.
Yeah, so thanks for bringing that up. Yeah, so as you say, we've seen a couple of bills, most notably, well, I think the one that made it further along was in Oregon. And then we've seen a couple of proposals at the federal level, just sort of saying, hey, obviously our data has value to these companies. We should make them spell out what that value is and then maybe pay it back to us. And I think, on the face of it, that sounds like a pretty fair thought. And I certainly see why it is appealing to people. But I guess really my concern is, well, it's sort of a couple of things, right? So my data individually to Facebook may not, as a pure back of the envelope sort of division problem, right, is not that much. But the damage that can be done if that data is misused or, even used in ways that I don't expect, is far more than the like $1.50 or, even $50, $100 that, that someone might shoot back to me. If somebody gives me $100 for my location history, and implicit in that deal is, okay, well, we collected your location data. Here's $100. They bought it. Like, what are the terms of that deal? Can they then do whatever they want with that? If all the places that I go, the coffee shop I frequent, that kind of stuff, where I get on and off the BART, gets into the wrong hands, that could be really, really damaging, right? If it gets into somebody who is looking for me that, that I don't want to find me. And so it's just sort of, to me, the value argument is sort of the wrong conversation to be having, because the cost of losing control of your data is so much higher than, anything that someone could pay me. And so that's one area that we worry about with data valuation. The other area is, of course, someone may be in a position to say, $150 is not that much to me, but, for some people that is a lot, that is a lot of money. And we never want to see privacy become a luxury good, but we certainly don't want to see people incentivized to pour data into the system that is already not great to people with low incomes, to minorities, to women. And so, I think we just worry about sort of what incentives that sets up. And so that's why we're just wary about sort of where these data valuation arguments lead.
Yeah, it's a good point. I mean, we've gotten a lot more visibility over the past year of what happens to our data when we really haven't done anything more but click on a statement that we haven't read. So, and sometimes the data gets in not the right hands, but rather than stolen or breached, it's actually merged with other data on purpose. Like my likes in a vacuum certainly, as it turns out, tell us a lot, but combined with my credit card history and my location history, and now you've got some much more powerful data than the likes by themselves. So, it, the, forgetting about all the other issues, how do you calculate it? It's mind numbing.
Yeah, absolutely. And, as you say, some of those algorithms, as you say, you don't know when they're merged, you don't know how they're merged. And so you also don't know if they're right or wrong. And so it's like if somebody's looking at my likes and my dislikes and my credit history and they're combining it, and then that decides whether or not I get a mortgage, to not be able to to kind of lose out on like the dream of home ownership, for example, because an algorithm looked at my likes and my credit history. Even if it was correct, that would be troubling. But especially if it's wrong, that's even more troubling. And there's no transparency into how those algorithms work either. And so there's just a lot of things that, as you say, when you're dealing with data, people often think it's less biased or there's something more, clinical or less subject to judgment values about it. But, I think we all know that's not really the case.
Right, right. It tends to perpetuate the wrongs we've already, committed. So, given what what Cambridge Analytica uncovered with just likes, uh, how much we all thought that was a fairly non-committal thing to do. It turns out we give away a lot, and that's just a very small, insignificant piece of our digital footprint. Do you think online privacy is even a possibility?
Well, I'm not willing to give it up yet. So, I think, that is sort of, there is this fatalistic approach that I do hear from people where it's like, well, we're just already so screwed. And like, what can we do? There's no putting this genie back in the bottle or cat back in the bag or whatever metaphor you want to torture. But, I think we can demand that companies that entities that collect this information act more responsibly with it, moving forward. Like just because something is bad, just because something bad has happened, it doesn't mean we have to let it keep happening. I do understand like these are issues that probably nobody thought of, right, when they were looking at these products and when they were making them. And do I wish they thought about privacy earlier? Of course I do. But I guess a better world is possible. And just because bad things have happened already, that doesn't mean that we can't work to improve them.
Yeah, so that's a good point, Haley. In a sense, it's like the nuclear argument when who gets it, what can you do with it? More recently, even gene editing. Uh, these things need to be regulated. That's a good point. So it's out there, but that doesn't mean it has to just go wild.
Right. And I think, as you alluded to earlier, like a lot of people are unhappy about the way things are right now. And so we can channel that into something, more positive and, build a better future.
Let's hope so. So you've mentioned a few times, in your past life as a journalist, why the career change? What brought you from the Washington Post and journalism to Electronic Frontier Foundation and advocacy?
Yeah. So as you said, sort of as background, I was a tech, mostly consumer tech, some tech policy, some privacy reporter at the Washington Post for 8 years. So I started there in 2010. It was in many respects a dream job, right? That's like all I'd ever wanted to be was a journalist. But as I covered more of these companies and really kind of got to understand the limits of what the law could do and sort of how much of the information that well, let's see, and how much of how the information I was giving these companies was safeguarded sort of, by their honor, right? By their own policies, by their agreements, and kind of seeing, at a certain point, I don't think these companies are evil, right? I think that they are companies. They have duties to shareholders. They have duties to have profits, and I understand that. But I think as a reporter, I was having a lot of trouble not just saying, hey, you should really be better when it comes to privacy. And if you're not going to be better, then someone should make you be better. And as a journalist, that is not the place of a journalist, right? The place of a journalist is, I still believe, to be as objective as you possibly can to present the situation so that people can be informed. And I was really running up against the limits of what I felt in my heart I wanted to say, as opposed to what I felt really my duty as a journalist that I could say. And so, I'd followed EFF, I'd interviewed people here before for stories, and I saw this job come up for a legislative activist. And I was like, that sounds exactly like the kind of thing I want to do. And I knew that it felt right when I wrote the cover letter in like 20 minutes. It's like sometimes you can feel your heart running towards something. And luckily they liked it, and here I am.
So, and now 10 months later, you totally regret the move?
Not at all. I really love the work we're doing. I think, it does scratch that itch. It's really interesting being sort of on the, to have a courtside seat to the CCPA fight, for example, and really talking to people who've been thinking about this stuff for a long time and sort of really thinking about how we can protect privacy legislatively, and what are the limits, what are things that we have to think about, right? Like when privacy and free speech issues intersect, to think deeply about those kinds of things. So I don't know, I'm having a ball.
It sounds like congratulations. Haley, what can't you believe I didn't ask you?
Let's see. That is such a great question that I always used to close my interviews with. I wasn't the primary, because I work on state stuff, so I wasn't the primary person working on the San Francisco government ban on government use of facial recognition. But that was a huge deal, and I think when we first heard about it, we thought, well, that would be really cool, but I don't know if the political movement is there, I don't know if any of that, if we can really get that done. And then when that passed, that was really amazing. It was sort of, precedent setting in a really interesting way. And then, since then we've seen Somerville, Massachusetts, which is where Tufts University is. We've seen them pass a ban. We've seen Oakland pass a ban. We've seen Berkeley. And, now we're seeing sort of other people say, other cities kind of realize, oh, well, I don't agree with that. And so maybe we could do that. Change moves in a lot of directions that you don't expect. I think that's been really interesting. And, I firmly believe that facial recognition is, sort of that indiscriminate scanning of people's faces as you walk down the street. That's really, really troubling. And so, I don't know, it's just been really interesting for me to see how that narrative has changed and how cities have led it. I think that's been fascinating.
Yeah, that's a good point. Facial recognition is fast emerging as another nuclear topic, you might say.
Yeah.
So thank you so much for joining us, Haley. I really appreciate your time and your expertise.
Thanks for having me.
Mm-hmm. And thank you all for joining us. Until next time, bye-bye.